I'm very pleased to have here with us at El Colegio de México Jeff Passel, which is a very distinguished American demographer, and their reference when we talk about migration statistics in the U.S. in general. So, welcome.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. And we thought that it was a great opportunity having here Jeff for academic purposes to talk about the migration trends in the U.S. in general, but probably starting with the Mexican-U.S. trends. No? So we know, or we have been saying since 2010, that we are at a turn point in terms of the dynamics and migration between Mexico and the U.S. So what did the most recent statistics say?
We've really had, the whole series has been very dramatic. There's always been, as you and your colleagues know, there's always been migration between Mexico and the U.S. But in terms of large-scale settlement in the U.S., we really didn't have that historically. So just to put this in perspective, as recently as 1970, there were about 750,000 Mexican immigrants living in the United States. Today it's over 12 million. So it's a dramatic change in a fairly short period of time. And the numbers grew rapidly starting from 1970. The numbers tripled in the 70s, and then doubled in the 80s, and then doubled again in the 90s. So we've gone from 750,000 to about 12 million. The numbers grew rapidly in the 2000 decades as we were getting 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 or more Mexicans coming every year, and the population was growing steadily. It reached a little bit over 12 million in 2007, and then things changed dramatically. The migration started to slow. It actually started to slow about 2005, in part, I believe, because of the housing market in the U.S., which went into a recession before the big recession. But when the Great Recession hit in 2007, 2008, migration really started to drop because there weren't jobs for people. And the numbers of Mexicans living in the United States dropped a little bit between 2007 and 2009, from a little bit under 13 million to about 12.2 million. Since then, the flows have remained low. We're still getting about 150 to 175,000 Mexicans moving to the United States every year, but that's not enough to offset the people moving back to Mexico. So we've basically seen constant population numbers at a little bit over 12 million. And it's a really dramatic shift. From the data I have, that covers basically year by year, 1990 onward, the numbers of Mexicans coming to the United States was very closely tied to employment in the U.S. So if unemployment dropped in the U.S. and there were jobs available, people needed to work, the migration flows from Mexico to the U.S. went up. And they peaked in 2000. They went down with the 2000 recession. They went back up. And so these numbers went up and down until about 2010. And after 2010, the unemployment picture in the United States improved dramatically. But for the first time in this 20-year cycle, Mexican migration did not come back.
So you're suggesting that in this new stage of U.S.-Mexico migration, migration is not so tied to what's happening in the American labor market?
It appears that way. You know, I hesitate to make any long-term statements about it, but it does appear that this linkage between the American labor market and Mexican migration has changed and may not be there as much. And of course, you know, migration is there's a lot of other factors. There's the situation in Mexico that's contributed to some of the the ups and downs. There's the enforcement effort put in at the border that's affected unauthorized migration. But it does appear that what appeared to be a very direct link between employment opportunities and Mexican flows is not there anymore.
So you have been very clear in pointing how the figures have changed. Less migration from Mexico to the U.S., basically. I want to ask, when we move into more detail about what the figures suggest, and I'm trying to build, if you look at the Mexico-U.S. migration history, you see, well, so we had until the mid-80s the model of a male migrant coming and going from rural areas, low skills. Then you have the 90s and you start building, because of family migration, this large Mexican community, which young children we are seeing now represented in the Dreamers, and who are this young population entering the labor market and studying at the American universities when it's possible. So what do you think would be the feature in terms of these trends between Mexico and the U.S. for the future, given the changes in the
well,
amount of migrants?
The sort of fundamental issue for a lot of the Mexico-U.S. migration is what kind of channels there are for people to get to the United States. And part of the reason there's been so much undocumented, unauthorized migration is that there haven't been legal channels for people to use. We have continued to get legal immigration from Mexico. Mexico is the largest sender of legal immigrants to the United States and has been for a very long time. It appears in my data that 60 to 70% of the immigration flow that we're getting every year is legal immigrants coming, maybe even a little more. And those are still families. Wives joining husbands, children joining their parents, families migrating together. The data I have suggests that at least the population that's in the United States is now not that stereotypical single male is not is a very small minority of the Mexican migrants living in the United States. Even the unauthorized immigrants living in the United States, only about a quarter to a third of the unauthorized immigrants are these unattached males.
Okay. So if in the 70s we had like this very specific type of migrations, and then in the 90s we learned about this more heterogeneous profile of women, children, aside from working age men. So you would say that now is this composition of a flow where you have documented and undocumented components. So what one of the other things that you have done for a long time is estimates undocumented migration, which is really hard. What have you found in terms of trends on undocumented migration?
Well, for Mexico, Mexico remains the largest number of unauthorized immigrants. We estimate there's a little bit over 11 million unauthorized immigrants living in the United States in our most recent data, which is 2014. And about 5.8 million of them are from Mexico. And the next largest country is only about a tenth of that. So Mexico still represents a majority of the unauthorized immigrants, but just a bare majority. But that 5.8 million is a number that's in 2007 it was 6.9 million, so it's almost 7 million. So it's actually dropped by 1 million since 2007, and that's a combination of people returning more people returning than coming, and the returns are, some are voluntary and some are not. Some are the deportations. But here again, there was a dramatic shift in 2007. Before 2007, the numbers were going up steadily by about 300,000 per year, and had been going up that rapidly for 15 to 17 years. So, you know, this is a case where the recession caused a very immediate and sharp change. It appears that there was a lot of return migration to Mexico between 2007 and 9. So, but yeah, after the recession, a lot of Mexicans left. And since 2009, there are still more unauthorized immigrants coming back to Mexico than coming to the United States, but it's a slower decline. The overall numbers in the U.S. have held constant since about 2009, even while the Mexican population figures have dropped a little bit. And the difference is being made up by unauthorized immigrants from other places. So the numbers have gone up for Central Americans, for Asians, smaller increases from Africa. But it's the Asians and Central Americans that are offsetting this decrease in Mexicans.
Okay, so I have a last question that has to do with this, the argument that you just mentioned. So we have documented and studied a lot this change in terms of the decrease in the flows between Mexico and in the U.S. But what happens when you look at the U.S. in the larger context? You already talked a little bit about how unauthorized migration has changed for other groups with a different trend from what we see for Mexicans. But when you look at the overall picture about immigration to the U.S. from different countries, what's the trend?
We saw the legal immigration system to the United States works a little bit differently. I've characterized the unauthorized flows as discretionary. In other words, people can decide to come to the United States or not. They respond to labor market conditions. They respond to conditions in their home country. If the labor market is improving in the United States, we've seen more people come as unauthorized immigrants. If conditions in sending regions deteriorate, like in Central America, we've seen people pushed out and come as unauthorized immigrants. The legal immigration system is more like a gate.
Okay.
That there are people lined up and waiting, and when they get to the front of the line, they tend to come, whether conditions are great or not. So while we saw a large decrease and even a reversal of unauthorized flows after the recession, we saw almost no change in legal immigration. So the number of legal immigrants that we're admitting is maybe 5% less than it was 10 years ago. And at least in the current situation, in the current policy environment, I see that continuing. We're getting large numbers from Asia. We still get large numbers from Mexico, but we're getting large numbers from Asia. We're seeing increasing flows within the legal system from Africa, in part because the way our system works is that if you have relatives in the United States, it's easier to immigrate. So we've been getting flows of both refugees and legal immigrants from Africa, and so they can now bring their relatives. So those numbers are going up a little. If you look at the demography of the United States, and we're talking about demography, the major demographic change that we're going to have over the next 15 to 20 years is the large baby boom cohorts that were born between 1946 and 1964. So these are people who are now, well, the first baby boomers started reaching age 65 in 2011.
Okay.
And by 2030, all of the baby boomers will be 65. And so we're seeing large numbers of baby boomers exiting the labor force. And the entry cohorts are large, but they're not as large as some of the ones leaving. And we had a baby bust in the 70s, so there's some kind of holes in the age structure. So for our labor force to keep growing, we need immigrants. And the particular need is over the next 15 years. And with the aging of our population, as the baby boomers retire, there will be demand for healthcare workers and a variety of healthcare and aids to help people with the activities of daily life. And traditionally, those have been filled by immigrants. So there's a demand for immigrants. Whether we'll change our policies to permit immigration to increase, I don't know. I mean, and this is not a mystery. We've known this, with demographic projections, you're always guessing about fertility in the future. But for the people who are already alive, we have a pretty good sense of how those populations are going to age. So the U.S. Census Bureau did some population projections around 2000. And it was one of the first ones where they actually tried to model migration. And in the assumptions about future levels of migration, they assumed that immigration levels would be increased during the 2020s to help account for this retirement cohort. Now, whether that's going to happen, I don't know. And as you know, in the case of Mexico, the cohorts coming of age, of migration age, are not as large. And so, there's not as many Mexicans to migrate to the U.S. So
not as many as 15, 20 years
ago. Right, and so, I can foresee immigration increasing to the U.S., maybe even unauthorized, but I don't think we'll see Mexican migration get back to the levels that we saw in the 90s,
so
early 2000s.
There may be a pool from other countries.
There's no shortage of potential migrants in the world.
That's an interesting hypothesis.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of people who could migrate to the United States. It's whether the channels for migration will be there or not. I mean, the thing about Mexico is we share the border.
We're neighbors.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.